First question that I need to ask is, are there any declarations of pecuniary interest? And I'm not seeing any nods or acknowledgements, so I will move on to adoption of the minutes. So the minutes have been circulated as part of the meeting agenda. And are there any errors or omissions, corrections in the minutes? There being none, I would like to ask for a mover and a seconder for this resolution that be it resolved that the Township of Georgian Bay Planning Advisory Committee approves the minutes of May 3rd, 2024 as circulated.
I move.
Moved by Peter Folds, seconded by Beth Hallpenny. All in favor by show of hands. And carried. Thank you. Open forum, we don't have any open forum. And so we'll move into our new business, and we have two items of new business. I think everyone was aware that these items were on our agenda last time, and we didn't have an opportunity to dive into them in any depth. I did get some communication from our Director of Planning and Manager of Planning that they're interested in understanding some of the context, if you will, from those of us in the community on this topic. And if I could, just kind of by way of reference, in the past, we would often get a report from our planning department providing us with kind of initial comments and then kind of direction as to where they wanted us to go. But we haven't had that in this case, which is fair and understandable. So what I would like to do, given my history, if you will, with the township, I would like to start off by just kind of setting the stage for these two topics. And I think the key that we are trying to achieve from a community standpoint is that there are considerations about what a waterfront lot is or should be that will and should impact the as of right approach to building and development. And it's also the same for navigable waters. And what I mean by that is, if we think about the building code, for example, today, or even some of the bylaws that we have within the township, if I comply with the building code, if I comply with the zoning bylaws, I don't have to go and ask for permission to do something. I can just go ahead and do it. What is different, though, especially on Georgian Bay, is that a waterfront lot is today maybe a waterfront lot, and tomorrow a devastation of sand and muck or just totally dry land. And so if I could, I'm allowed to screen share? Okay, so what I'd like to do is do a little screen sharing to give us some insights into what we need to understand about Georgian Bay. And I've forgotten, how do I, just a sec here. There we go. Just working on screen sharing technology and share. Is anybody seeing anything? There we go. Okay. So just bear with me for a second here. And I'm going to use a property that is going to be discussed later on in another forum, but I thought it would be useful to use this as an example, and there's lots of examples on the bay that we can consider. So what I'm looking at here is a bay. This is the District of Muskoka's air photo maps. And so what they've done here is they've now produced 2023 versions of this high quality resolution maps. But what I'd like to do is is just go back in time a little bit and help us understand what this bay looked like back in low water. So here we are, and it's so nice of this district mapping system because I can just click on the different years of the map and see the dramatic differences. So here we are in 2013, and you can see that the bay is mostly mud or dried up shoreland. And so that is, I think, a good example of the impacts of the Georgian Bay environment. So we've got 2013, which was a year after the absolute low water. So 2011, 2012, the water would have been even lower. And what we would have seen is dryness right out to the edge of the bay. We pop up to 2018, pop up to 2023. Somebody looking at this would think, oh my God, it's a great place. You know, if there was a property that was for sale in there, I might find that was particularly attractive, and I might want to look at it. So that is, I think, if I could project what I think we're trying to accomplish, if we were to define this area based on the 2013 view, which is low water, we might conclude that this really isn't a waterfront lot, and this because there's no water touching the lot at the top. And we might conclude that this was not a navigable waterway because you can't get even a small boat or a canoe in there, let alone a work barge or other things that were some of the key criteria that we were talking about the other day. So let me move away from that for a second, and I'll come back down to what everybody probably knows, which is the lily pad. And once again, this is 2013. 2013 is when there was a significant amount of dredging being done by almost all the marinas. In fact, I'm going to zoom here in on Nautilus Marina, and you can see the dredging equipment in the bay doing the dredging to accommodate this ultra low water that we had in 2012 and 2013. But if I then kind of go back to Village Marina area, this is Village Marina. You can see the huge plume of disturbed water that was as a result of the dredging. And I think one would conclude, if we look here at this, hopefully you can see that this is kind of a sand dirt area. This is what we call the lily pond. And one would look at that there and say, that's no access. And so even though there are lots of properties along the shoreline here and along the shoreline up here, nobody would ever think for a second that that was a waterfront lot. And nobody would think for a second that this was navigable water. But let's jump up to 2018 or even to 2023. And now we're starting to see that this previously completely inaccessible area, some real estate guy from somewhere is likely going to say, well, this is great. I can now start selling waterfront land to people that was never waterfront before. And I think that my belief is that this is somewhat absurd. And certainly in the Lily Pond area, nobody that has lot frontage on the Lily Pond has ever thought that they should be entertaining putting a dock in the Lily Pond and trying to get a boat into or out of that area. And so I might ask the somewhat rhetorical question, why would we entertain the idea of development in the Lily Pond, or why would we ever entertain the idea of development in a bay like this? And there are lots of these out on Georgian Bay. So all of this is really to kind of set the stage, hopefully for more discussion. But the objective here is, if there are properties that have this characteristic of you can't get there, and we put on the table for beginnings of our conversation last time you know, if we consider that getting there by a canoe is not the standard, getting there by a work barge, by a septic pump out barge, by an EMS safety fireboat requirement, if those are key characteristics of access to those properties, then perhaps we need to redefine what a navigable waterway is and what a waterfront lot is, so that anybody coming to the township and asking for permission to build something would first be met with, well, that's not something you can do as of right. You can always ask for permission and get variances and bylaw changes and etc. But what we're trying to do, I think, here is redefine the characteristics of what I have a right to do, and that is currently not reflected in any of the zoning bylaws that we have in the township. So I'm going to pause there for a moment, and I see I have, just let me see if I can make my screen here a little bit bigger. Oh, come on. Okay, we have a question here, first of all, by David Clark. So David, go ahead.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, and through you, I just have a question. Does this apply to the augmentation or addition? Like in this case, we're looking at dredging operations and the decreased waterway, but also where people now augment that shoreline and put in sand and other things that could impact the environment and the navigation around that area. And I think the one I look at is on Potato Island Road, where a considerable amount of sand and stuff has been put there to create a beach and stuff. And I don't know whether that permission was granted or not granted. But does that apply to that? And also in these cases, both for the ones you discussed and where they would be augmented, how do we as a township enforce that? And if there's not a piece in the bylaw already?
Good questions. I'm going to put our director of planning on the spot here, if I could. My understanding was that there wasn't an ability to bring in sand and place it on below the high water mark. Is that true, or what's your read on that?
There we go. To the chair, so I'm not familiar with that particular Potato Island Road situation that Mr. Clark's referencing to. Certainly any works within the shoreline area or within the water would require a work permit. That could be an M&R work permit. It could be a DFO, Department of Fisheries and Oceans approval. Generally speaking, is it easy to get approval to deposit fill sand within a waterway? No, but I can't really offer any more than that at this time.
Beth?
When we had, thank you, Mr. Chair, when we had a discussion a number of meetings ago on site alteration, that was one of the things that we talked about being part of the site alteration bylaw, and then that didn't come forward in any substantive way. I think you made a minor modification to it. But surely I think filling is absolutely something that should be addressed in more detail in the site alteration bylaw. Even the types of material that is being used as fill, because I raised at the time that asphalt was a suitable fill material, and that certainly is not a suitable fill material along the shoreline. So I believe we need to enhance that site alteration bylaw, look at it a bit more carefully. There's no question people have been filling in beaches, whether they had permits or not. And I think the bylaw addresses if you had an existing beach, like a naturally occurring beach, versus one that you're trying to create in a situation that probably doesn't make any sense. It'll get washed away. So I just offer that comment because we did have that discussion a few meetings ago. Thank you.
So it's probably something we need to dig into. My understanding was that it was illegal to bring in sand fill in and place it below the high water mark, unless you had a permit to do that. And I don't know whether, well, I do know that there is a property on the side of Little Bosley Island where a property owner got approval to put sand on their shoreline. Whether or not that's below the high water mark or not, I don't know, but they got a ministry approval to do that. Ian, did you have a comment there?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just sort of referencing the plan in Cognition, and we looked at sort of three sort of elements with respect to lots. One is new lot creation, and we essentially put a test in place for any new lot creation. There had to be access to the property in low water conditions without having to dredge or blast for that access. And also, the applicant had to prove that there was the ability to access the lot, as you mentioned earlier, by whether it's a barge, which is critical. If you have a septic system, it will need to be pumped out on occasion, and without access, you really, I don't think, can sort of sustain the environmental characteristics of that lot. So there really was, in Cognition, many ways for new lot creation, there was a test of accessibility, in which lends itself to navigable waterways. And the navigable waterways was essentially you had to demonstrate that you can get to that lot by barge, by construction boat, by emergency services, etc. The second was if there was an existing lot with a development on it and in high water, low water conditions, there is nothing that we would suggest that the owner of that lot would not have access to it, and if necessary, would be given permission, I would assume through the township, for limited dredging and maybe blasting if necessary below the high, or below the, I think we had below the low water mark. I think that the point I think we have to address is where we have lots of records that have currently a hold in place, how we deal with those. And to me, that's where you're sort of saying, just because you own a lot, you have the right to develop it if you have no access to it. It's like I have a lot in the middle of the woods, but I've got no road to get there. Then you're going to have to hike there, but you're not going to be able to develop it. So it's really the holds. I think that I think as a township, we have to put policies in place that would essentially lay out the framework that would identify what would be necessary for the applicant or for the owner of that lot that's in a hold to be removed. And to me, without question, they have to prove that you have access to that property without having to dredge, without having to blast. Otherwise, you really, I think, are creating an environmental disaster that we saw in Cognition not that long ago. I was the chair of the Georgian Bay Land Trust at the time, and there was an adjacent lot to lots that we own, and there was an applicant that came forth to lift a hold, and we opposed it. We had to do that based on sort of federal guidelines that restrict sort of how we look at our own properties. But I guess my point is, Mr. Chair, is that I think one has to demonstrate to lift a hold on a lot that's not been developed, that there is absolutely access by construction barge, by emergency services, and not by canoe, not by airplane, not by helicopter. They have to demonstrate that you can get there without having to alter the access and shoreline. Thank you.
So if I could net out a little bit of what you're saying is key to the two topics in front of us, Waterfront Lot and Navigable Waterway. There needs to be language in there and in our bylaws that define those characteristics that you've been highlighting that would apply for anybody looking for as of right development. And only when they cannot comply with those characteristics would they then need to come to Committee of Adjustment or Planning Council for we'll call it advanced consideration. Is that fair?
Yeah, that would be, Mr. Chair. But I guess we're looking at lots that were created well before there are any planning policies in the township. And it could have been the ministry that came in and carved up these lots. But they at the time there was no real discussion of accessibility, and so without question, it's really those sort of existing lots of record that have been there for decades are the ones that we really have to sort of, I think, put the wording in place so that if someone is looking to buy a lot, they have to make sure that there is some form of test that is put in place that the township would overhear or oversee that would ensure that there is access and it is a navigable waterway on the shoreline of those marginal or lots of record.
So perhaps I could ask you another question on that, just to get your thoughts on this. So let's assume that I have a lot of record, and it's not currently developed, and I want to develop it. What constraints should we be applying to this? In other words, what are the key factors that we need to fold into our new OP and zoning bylaws to govern that? And secondly, what about the zoning? So what we see in some examples is a property is zoned, shoreline residential or shoreline island residential, and that sets an expectation, especially in the real estate world, that I've got something that's got value and I'm going to do something with it. But what we often find is the owner of the property sells it for a song and a dance. The buyer thinks he's got an awesome deal, and then the buyer doesn't really understand what the seller understood, which is the likelihood of ever developing it is pretty slim. So maybe could you offer some comments on that?
There's a bit of a dilemma there, and there is an expectation if you own something, you can develop it. And that's where I think there has to be some means of communication to whether it's real estate agents, contractors, or out to the community in general, that just because you own a lot doesn't necessarily mean you can develop it. As I said, I think the wording has to be, I think, put in place to establish the some means of testing the development applicability of those lots. But again, I think you go back to maybe the real estate agents who are out there looking to sell these properties, or owners trying to sell these properties, but sharing that you really, it's not an automatic right for development. But Mr. Chair, it's not an easy solution. It is something that to take away development rights on someone that owns a piece of property that at times is accessible via boat, but at other times it isn't. It's really looking at that low water conditions and assessing based on those low water conditions the accessibility of that shoreline.
Derek, can I put you on the spot again? What mechanisms might there be to consider the kinds of concerns that are being raised here, to somehow reflect a on a property or change the zoning of a property to reflect what we know today, that the original, you know, whoever was the surveyors back, you know, 50, 100 years ago, whatever, didn't know, didn't consider, wouldn't have any thoughts of. So how do we overlay that onto lots of existing lots, because there aren't many opportunities for new lots, but there are lots of existing lots that have not been developed that don't have a hold on them, but also, in as the examples we've been showing, may not be accessible.
So to the chair, I think you touched on it earlier when you spoke about the disconnect between what people may have a right to do today and what our zoning bylaws currently address or do not address. And moving forward, there's certainly going to be always going to be an element of inherent rights that people do have, certain development rights, and sometimes through the course of planning applications, as unpalatable as it may sometimes be, some of those rights we may find are not extinguishable. So there will still be circumstances where people will have rights to access or develop or expand, enlarge, etc., or even develop something that's vacant. However, the bigger challenge, and now have a greater understanding of the issue, because it's certainly not a new issue, and through this agenda and in previous discussions, the labels attached to it, Waterfront Lots and Navigable Waterways, really pertains to this larger issue that we're discussing, and the issues are interconnected, right? And it's something that this would probably be a good opportunity to bring the committee up to speed on, something that's been initiated within the department. And actually, I'd like to thank Planning Advisory Committee member Clark for this. So following a previous meeting, member Clark and I had an very brief offline discussion, but he introduced me to Professor Alexander Hay at the University of Toronto. Alexander Hay is in the Faculty of Engineering. However, Professor Hay's expertise is in risk management, risk adaptation, adaptation to climate change, and he teaches several courses that are not just engineering courses, although they are in the engineering faculty. They're multidisciplinary courses where they bring in students, and these are master's or PhD students from various faculties. And the courses involve the students taking on a problem, a challenge. And they look at it, they don't have to be engineers, they don't have to be planners, they don't have to be hydrogeologists. They really look at this from a first principles perspective, not from a lens of for example, the expertise that planning staff may have or that a coastal engineer may have. Anyways, what we've done is we've met a couple times with Professor Hay. He's agreed to accept the problem that we've posed to him. And it's very much what this committee is discussing today and beyond. So we talked about dealing with development policies, also the provision of emergency services and other services to properties, water access only properties, island properties, remote properties, in the context of significantly fluctuating water levels and whatever factors are contributing to that, and also short, medium, and long term. So from a climate change perspective as well, and looking at how we address these issues and what are sort of the first principles approaches that we need to look at to start framing putting the terms of reference around the work that we need to do. So from a land use planning policy perspective, from a provision of emergency and other services perspective, from the impacts that these workarounds that we've heard here, people dredge, blast, etc., those in turn have impacts, ecological impacts, etc. So this is really current. So we're going to the same place, and we've engaged some, hopefully some, I believe, some really smart people to look at this. We anticipate we will have a report, initial report in September and October from Professor Hayes' group. Those are the shorter courses, and then he's got longer courses that he teaches that will take over from where the short courses left off. So again, I want to thank Member Clark, and this is the first time he's hearing this because him and I chatted briefly through text, but I'm updating him by way of this conversation in terms of where that sidebar conversation has taken us, and it aligns precisely with what the committee is talking about today. And the ultimate goal here is to provide us with some direction in terms of reference to help us understand what studies we need to undertake, what direction we need to go in to have in place appropriate policies that balance, again, there are certain inherent rights, but also balance what constitutes good planning, protection of this UNESCO biosphere that we have here, right? So very current. I don't have an answer to what the particular mechanisms are. Certainly the Cognishing policies are provide for that, and they're the right start. But in terms of, as we've seen, and as I think both council and committee of adjustment have struggled with, particularly those situations where we're dealing with existing rights and existing properties and existing development, and where people are looking to utilize their development rights. And wherever we go with this, and I'm going to go back to a question you asked, Mr. Chair. I think we also have to be prepared that there will be situations where we may be challenged on this. So as an example, the question was, well, what do we do with these historic properties that have been created a long time ago that really had no clear or appropriate regard for the topography, water levels, shoreline conditions, etc. So in other circumstances, municipalities, if these were plans of subdivision, we would deem them not to be plans. We would pass deeming bylaws. And there's certainly lots of examples across Ontario where plans of subdivision were just overlaid, or checkerboarded is often the term, onto the land without any regard for the natural features or constraints. And they were undevelopable, unworkable, and through a deeming bylaw process, they were deemed not to be plans of subdivision. That's not quite what we're talking about here. I don't think a lot of these situations are subdivisions, but through zoning and policy, we may find ourselves in a situation where we may, as an example, through zoning, be looking to potentially attempt to extinguish rights. So what's a shoreline residential island zoned property now, SRI, if we were to zone it to open space in the future, there may be implications to that. We may be challenged on that, but it still represent good planning to do so. So these are the sorts of things we're examining, and I'm just very pleased to learn that what I'm hearing today about these two subject matter items, waterfront lots and navigable waterways, aligns very nicely with the problem question that we've posed to Professor Hay and his team.
Great, thank you. David, you're up next.
Through the chair, and that's great for the update, Derek. I'm glad that worked out. And just so the committee members know as well, upon completion of the time period they're given to solve the problem, the students actually do a presentation at U of T, which can be attended in person by members of this committee or staff and or counselors. And they also have an opportunity, I think, to do a video feed as well, and they get a written report submitted back to Derek that is able to be shared, so that if you have questions when they pose possible solutions, you can ask those to the student, and they welcome that because it's real world projects and real world feedback that they're getting. So That's an excellent thing. The question I had, and I don't know if it's in the bylaw, and I couldn't see it, but perhaps it would trigger a closer look at some of these properties. Is there a requirement upon sale for an environmental survey of that property be done that would identify things as we've talked about and species at risk and stuff that would curtail that possible development if that actually does exist in that spot? And that was my question. So thank you.
Back to our director of planning. I think I know some of the answer, but I'll let you answer.
Yeah, appreciate the question, and the short answer is no. Unless that property is already, zoned with constraints identified, etc. We have certainly lands that are different categories, whether it be open space zones or in some cases in other municipalities, hazard land zones, right? But at a property transaction perspective, someone doing their due diligence is going to be looking at the zoning and the regulations that are applied to that property. We as staff certainly have no ability to sort of intervene and color that or have a control over that transaction. The transaction will occur based on a buyer's due diligence. If I could use an analogy here, if we substitute for a moment shoreline access, water access with road access, and imagine, if you will, a property that you look at it two-dimensionally on an aerial photo. It's a property. It's got frontage on a public road, but on the ground, that frontage is met with a sheer rock face. Does it have frontage? Yes. Does it meet the requirements of the zoning bylaw? Yes. Will it get a driveway entrance? Maybe, maybe not. Is there a technical solution? Maybe. Someone could blast, someone could alter the land. They may or may not get a permit. There may be ecological considerations through that process, and it could cost them a lot of money and a lot that they would have to do to gain access to that property. But at the end of the day, it's still compliant.
Can't hear you.
Sorry, your microphone is off, X.
Oh, sorry. And the rock face is there 1 year and it's not there another year if you sort of parallel that to changing water levels. And that's the real challenge here in terms of how do we address that. And I think the direction that the Cognizant policies provide is a good one, looking at low water conditions, right? That's the test, that's the standard. But again, even if we put in place those policies, use holding provisions, change zoning, etc., just so the committee's aware, there will still be certain situations where there will be inextinguishable rights that we will find ourselves still having to deal with and permit certain forms of development to occur, as unsavory as that may be at times.
Okay, thank you. Peter.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Just a bit of anecdotal information for the planners, which touches on what Derek just said in terms of existing rights to development. We went through a community planning process in the Go Home Bay area in around 2004 to 2006. And as part of that community planning process, we worked closely with the township and examined each and every existing lot of record within the planning area. And that included some islands that were existing lots and undeveloped and zoned at that time SR1. But they were small islands and did not meet the standards for development that we were looking at in the development in preparing our community plan. and in some cases were unsuitable for development for other reasons. And through that process and through consultation with the property owners of those islands, we ended up rezoning, I think, a handful of those islands, maybe 5 or 6, to open space rather than developable. And that was done in large part without objection from the owners, who realized, I think, that they were practically undevelopable. And it's just something to consider if the township is looking at small islands or lots that are questionable in terms of development, even though they are currently zoned for development. It may be possible in some cases through negotiation, through discussion, to look at downzoning those properties. There's and there is some historical precedent for that. I realize it's not going to work in every instance, but just thought that sort of anecdotal information might be helpful.
Great. Thank you. Ian, you're up next.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess on sort of Peter's point, we tried to go through the process ourselves in Cognizine, and what we found was the zoning maps were not that accurate. And I think we did sort of ask maybe for some assistance from the township to use some aerial guidelines so that we could sort of establish it was primarily islands that were well undersized for development, but were still shown as an SRI 7. We unfortunately didn't get to the point where we were sort of went out to the property owners and were sort of asking for permission to sort of, as Peter suggested, downzoning. But does it make sense until we have some policies in place to look at sort of, I guess at this point, sort of an interim control bylaw that would be put in place to establish, until the policies are in place, establish that there's no rights of development until I think the township establishes, whether it's through this group through U of T and then further consultation. But if there's nothing in place now, to me, that I don't think is appropriate and nor recommended. And if there's a way to sort of mitigate what potentially could be sort of an environmental sort of impact, significant impact, for someone to just say, because there's no rules, I'm going to just develop this property if it meets certain minimum restrictions for development, but not access, and then you're just letting them then dredge or blast for that access. So is it something that the director or the township would consider in terms of an interim control bylaw until we have policies in place that would support develop or not support development? Thank you.
Derek. On the spot.
Yeah, it would be certainly something that I would like to give thought to, because, you know, in a conventional sense, an interim control bylaw is an emergency measure to address a changing or new or impending land use that poses some sort of threat or issue to the municipality that requires immediate attention and really this heavy-handed tool called an interim control bylaw. I dare say this is not a new issue for Georgian Bay, nor does it appear to me that, you know, in the next 12, 18, 24 months, we're going to suddenly see an influx of development on otherwise challenged properties. So given that we will be embarking on processes, the start of which is the work that I mentioned Professor Hayes' group will be looking at, and ultimately the update to the official plan and zoning bylaw, I think that work is underway to what it appears to be addressed this sort of very slow moving train that's coming our way. So As you can see by my language, I'm reticent to consider an interim control bylaw as a measure to address this. Rather would suggest initially that we continue to deal with these, case by case if and when they come forward.
Just before we go to you, Beth, having the benefit of history, and this is not you and your problem, but we've had so many planners where we've attempted to get these issues addressed. And the previous term planning committee, I believe, did propose an ICB to try to deal with things. And you also know that the proper categorization and zoning of all kinds of island properties is something that has been an ongoing topic that we've never gotten to. It keeps getting pushed off and pushed off and pushed off. And if I can take words, so to speak, or put words in Ian's mouth, I think the suggestion of an ICB is more reflective of everyone at the table here, or most of us at the table here in the planning committee, have lived through several cycles of planning staff where we start the conversation and then we get somebody new to work with, and we have to re-educate and get them up to the understanding of, oh my God, we really do have a problem. Yes, we should consider an ICB to stop this and actually put ourselves on notice that we have a year to deal with this, as opposed to, your comment was, the next 12 to 24 months. Well, I get that in a normal world, that would be probably a reasonable approach. But I would suggest that we would get a consensus of the planning committee whereby we've felt that way for so many years that we need to find a way to drive action in a shorter time window, or in the alternative, put in an ICB on these specific things, not a broad ICB, but a very specific channeled ICB. Anyways, that's a little history that I can share with you. Beth, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I would absolutely support that idea for the reasons that you're indicating. We were talking at the time about an interim control bylaw for all lots that are subject to hold, and even that lot subject to hold has never really been clarified. Is it islands? Is it subdivided islands? It should also be water access only properties on mainland. And I do understand you are talking about updating the OP and the bylaws, which should, I think, be in the next year. I don't know what your time frame is, but to points made before, this has languished for quite some time. The undersized islands issue is actually 10 years. When the official plan and the zoning bylaw were adopted, there was a commitment back then that they would address those undersized islands that were inappropriately zoned for development. I'd like to also talk a little bit about what developed means in the context of a few different things. So back then, there was some understanding of staff that if there was a dock on a vacant property, that it was considered developed. That doesn't consequence or isn't categorized as development per se, especially if it's a dock without a permit, which is often what we've seen. And in some cases, there are structures that are built on a property without a permit. That doesn't make them legal. It doesn't make them qualify as developed property. I think that's something that we need to start thinking about, defining what is a developed property. And for instance, your comment about potentially having to distinguish rights. I think in those situations, if somebody has bought something, and for instance, when they purchased it, they understand it was mixed bush, that doesn't constitute that it is a developed property. Even if it has an old building that may be demolished or maybe derelict and didn't have a permit to build, that doesn't constitute developed property. And I think when Cog Machine was developing its policies relative to, you know, when should you be allowed to apply to council? And by the way, it's not just council, it's not as of right, you have to apply to council, it's got to be approved by Ministry of Natural Resources, MOEE, or maybe even Fisheries and Oceans. It's not a right that you get to blast to dredge. But at the time when we were contemplating developed properties, that if, and to your point, Mr. Chair, was you're talking about shifting sand or, you know, things that have now caused you to not be able to get access to a developed property. And in the context of development, then we were thinking people that have had ownership of that property for years, have put money and investment into that property for years, have paid taxes for years. Obviously, if they've enjoyed that property and put all that time and effort into it, they should be allowed to maintain access. I think what we're seeing is people that are coming into this community and not having had that history. And so I'm not sure that those are inherent rights for a particular individual. So maybe we need to define what does it mean to be developed? A developed is not a dock without a permit on a property. A development is not a shed on an island without a permit. So I think those are things, and maybe this is what gets wrapped into a future process, greater definitions. I also wanted to talk about what's in the official plan right now related to access. And I went through all of the various policies, the waterfront policies, the new lot creation policies. It talks about access, but it doesn't define access. And one of the things that we want to come out of this process is how do you properly define what access is? And I think the photographs that were shared at the last meeting, Mr. Chair, probably are appropriate to consider. Access based on those barges and clearance that would be needed, they would need to have 5 feet of water. So right now, our definition just says a vessel, and a vessel says anything that floats. And previous staff took the position that as long as you could get there by a canoe, it was accessible and it had a navigable waterway. So those are clearly things that need to be identified. Cognasheen made an effort at it. And as a member Davis said, that was for a new lot creation, but I think that also needs to be expanded related to existing lots or existing lots that are on hold. And just lastly, the areas where we're seeing are usually areas that have fish habitat along the shoreline. They are sensitive areas. They are habitat for species at risk. And to the air photo that was previously shown on the screen, that bay is entirely type 1 fish habitat. There's so many things to consider. And I think an interim control bylaw, until we sort out these definitions, sort out the study requirements. I know Cognasheen requires a site evaluation study if you're a historic lot of record created before there were any planning regulations in this township or any scrutiny or evaluations for those sorts of things. So that's all I wish to say for now, but probably more. Thank you.
Thank you. Ian, you had your hand up. Did you?
No, I think Beth covered sort of, I think my additional comments. I guess the director pointed out that there may not be a flood, but it may be just one application that comes through that because the policies aren't in place, all of a sudden a perceived right of development could adversely and seriously impact fish habitat, environmentally sensitive areas that may not be mapped right now, but exist because of a lack of mapping that we have in our township. So I don't think we should dismiss the fact that there may not be a lot of cases, but it really just is one case that I think we need to prevent. And that's why I think an ICB may be appropriate to I think give the township, I think that that time to put the policies in place so that we make sure that development is occurring where it should occur, and not because an inherent right is perceived by the township as well as the property owner. Thank you.
Do you break? Okay, go.
Through the chair, I just wanted to bring up the fact that in interim control bylaw is not on the agenda. I know we're kind of a little bit steering off topic here. We do have waterfront lots and navigable waterways on the agenda. So I think if we wanted to have more of a fulsome discussion about potentially putting in an interim control bylaw, I think that would have to be added to another agenda. So I just kind of wanted to get the conversation back on track to the waterfront lots. I think our director of planning is looking for more specifics on that. So just putting that out there because I think we're getting a little bit off topic here. Thank you.
Okay, I would like to bridge back to a comment that Derek, you made earlier, that some properties have some inherent rights that we may not be happy with, but they're there. So one of the things that personal experience I've discovered that 10 years ago I could do something, but 5 years later I can't because the rules change. And so, for example, you know, there are properties in the Bay where you can go and develop, or at least we're able to develop things. And then we implemented some new policies, and they basically were overlaid on every property so that nobody got to escape and had rights that excluded those new criteria. So, for example, prior to us having a well-defined provincially significant wetland definitions all over the place, prior to us having well-defined fish F1 fish habitat, the constraints that are associated with those things didn't apply. People could do whatever, you know, the laws were at the time. But the laws changed. So I'm wondering at how inherent rights can live beyond some of the concerns. And I would suggest that much of the discussion that we've had over time, and certainly the legacy concerns that I've shared earlier about, and that Beth has shared earlier about the 10 years ago when the OP was and zoning bylaws were defined, there were all kinds of anomalies from a zoning standpoint that people said, well, we'll get to those, and here we are 10 years later, haven't got to those yet. But what inherent rights survive new policies? So, you know, if I want to come along as a township and I define, and perhaps with the help of this Alexander Hay and his team, what if I define new policies that deal with, you know, environmental impacts of lack of water access, waterfront capabilities, lack of navigable waterways, etc. What inherent rights might be left on those properties that would survive new policies that would define these new definitions that we hope we can get into the new OP of what a navigable waterway is and what a waterfront lot is. Like what could survive those that would supersede those things?
So essentially to the chair, you're asking a legal question, right? I'm just saying that any land use planning change, whether it's a change in policy to the official plan, and I'm talking about policies within our control. So our official plan or our zoning bylaw, any of those changes that might down zone or take away existing rights or perceived existing rights are open to challenge. That's simply the point I'm making. Individual circumstances, individual properties based on history of use, history of development, or lack thereof, challenges to those land use policy changes may hold water, they may not. But that's going to be a very individual sort of thing.
So down zoning has risks, but new policies like the fish habitat impact, where I'm within N number of meters of a F1 fish habitat, those supersede all other policies, don't they?
Again, any new policy change is subject to appeal and challenge.
Understood, but we've implemented in our township uh, a wetland policy that has setback requirements, and if you don't meet the setbacks, you are then required to produce environmental impact assessments that need to be peer reviewed before you get permission. So what I'm trying to understand here is from a as of right perspective, I can change the as of right perspectives by implementing new policies like fish habitat setbacks and environmental wetland policy setbacks. So I guess where I'm going here is you made a comment that there are some inherent rights out there, but if our objective is as a township to address our number one strategy, which is the environment, and if we come up with policies that support that number one strategy, and they are things like things that relate to environmental matters, we can call them fish habitat, wetlands, for simplistic, easy to better understand things. What is the definition of a waterfront lot? Because that is easily understood by anybody if you put a variety of criteria around it, which then hopefully triggers environmental criteria. So if I have a lot that, as some of the examples that I showed, there's no way to get access to it. In some cases, I could be 200 meters from the water in low water. Then redefining that should be a new overlay, and not necessarily take away somebody's ability to do something, but require them to do other things before they have the ability. So is that really where we're going here? If I have inherent rights, I can put additional constraints on those rights before I get to exercise those rights? Is that what you're meaning? Or are these inherent rights going to survive any new policies that we come up with?
Again, these would be very site-specific circumstances. So I think you're looking for some examples maybe, and if I could illustrate one. So if someone had a legal dock or a legal non-conforming dock, but it's type 1 fish habitat, but that dock's been there since 1972. There's probably very little the municipality can do in changing official plan policy or zoning to take away that legal right of boat access to that property, even in the context of very changing water levels. It's a legal question, but there may be a right of access there, right? So again, I think addressing policies to deal with waterfront lots and navigable waterways to create an improved planning regime that protects the environmental considerations, because that's where this is ultimately going. It's the environment that we're all concerned about. Can certainly add better controls, more useful limitations, more effective limitations that what one can and cannot do with a property. But I'm simply saying, be prepared that no matter what you do, you're not going to be able to stop every one of them. There will be certain situations where there will be inherent rights, and that will be very site specific, and that's just the reality of it. But best practices, best objectives. Let's do what we can based on the authority that we have within the controls that we have as a municipality.
Okay, David, you're up.
Through the chair, and I think that it's a bit of a slippery slope when you're talking about inherent rights and restricting individuals. Where there are generational properties in, for example, Cognoscene or 6 Mile, where those properties were developed way before any of this was in existence, and you didn't have to have those environmental things. Now, if you're going to restrict people, and we all want responsible development, taking the environment into play, could there be an argument from those other folks saying, well, that property there that's been there for 5 generations didn't comply back then, so why am I being uber restricted now when I want to do the right thing? And as Derek has said, you may get pushback from a number of individuals on that point because other things have happened in the past and have set a precedent, so to speak. But it's not to say that I'm not in favor of environmental protection or restrictions. It just has to be, I think, done properly so that we're not trampling on people's, as you said, the inherent rights to develop their properties and do it responsibly, but not make it so restrictive that they can't utilize that property that other people are utilizing now because it's been in their family for generations. So, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. You want to weigh in?
Thank you. I have a question for the Director of Planning, because we've been talking about policies and ways we can improve policies moving forward, and through the official plan review and zoning bylaw review. Do we have a timetable for the official plan review and zoning bylaw review, and how do you see that unfolding, and over what time period?
So I'm just waiting for the chair.
Sorry, please dive in.
Yeah.
Not formal.
Thank you. So the intent is to start the process certainly this year, starting with a request for proposals to prior to that, develop the terms of reference for the official plan review. And I think that's where the work of this committee can come in very handy, and get that request for proposals out, and hopefully retain a consultant this year to start the process. The scope, I think we need to be very clear on the scope. And that's going to help us understand the project budget, because the issues can be never ending, right? So we need to understand what it is we're trying to achieve, the appropriate level of consultation, the appropriate level of background study. If we're going to, start doing basic research, that's probably beyond the scope of what the budget would potentially allow. But if we can use available mapping resources, available data, for example, island size, LiDAR information, to understand topography, etc., that will be much more efficient. So stay tuned in terms of a report coming forward from staff, likely to Planning Council, in terms of proposing sort of some broad terms of reference, looking for direction from council and potentially direction to Planning Advisory Committee to assist in identifying the scope in terms of reference, and then getting that RFP out. So still working at that, but that's expected later this summer to commence.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to, David, ask you a question. You were concerned about kind of overlaying new policies on existing properties that have been in existence and used forever. But we already have a couple of examples, and I was referring to those earlier, where the wetland requirements and setbacks and fish habitat setbacks are new policies that have been overlaid on all existing properties. And if you seek development on an existing property, regardless of what you've done in the past, if you don't want to make a change, if you come to the township and ask for permission to do something, that may trigger these new constraints. And I was just wondering, first of all, that sounds like it is in conflict with what you were suggesting. Did you know about those requirements, and do those sound like they're impacting the comment you made?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I wasn't aware of everything that applied, but I was taking off of the comments of Derek, where with inherent rights, you could have legal challenges based on what has happened in the past, and that those may be upheld. And that, you know, there has been other development. I think the picture on the screen you have is what I was referencing earlier at Potato Island, where things have gone ahead and people have done things, but there seems to be no repercussion in the enforcement of those things. So that's sort of the vein I was going down. It's not to say that what was done in the past was wrong, but there could be a challenge to that based on the fact that that was then, and I realize it's different now. But you know, we don't want to dissuade people from enjoying Georgian Bay and you know, the interior by being over restricted or heavy handed in relation to development. And that's the only concern that I have. And as I said, I agree that environmental stuff comes well ahead of time before anything else, and that if you are purchasing a property, that you must do your due diligence on what happens now. I'm just saying, you know, how restrictive do we get, and how do we get there? And as Derek has referenced, a lot of that is legal question, not our own personal opinion or the committee's opinion. So
Two hands.
hopefully that answers.
Thank you, David. Derek, go ahead.
I just want to perhaps try and bring closure to one sort of theme, and perhaps I'm wrong, and if I am, correct me. But in terms of inherent rights, rights run with the property, with the land. They're not generally not extinguished by change of ownership or a new owner purchasing the property. So whether a property is it's a generational property, or it's purchased and a development proposal comes from the new kid on the block or the new kid on the island, if you will, there's no distinction there. So history and ties and history of investment and family ownership and that sort of thing really have no bearing on the use of lands in Georgian Bay.
So it doesn't matter how many times it changes hands, whatever somebody else might have done in the past may set a precedent for the future. That's a scary thing. Yes.
Just make some sort of broad planning comments, I guess. I mean, just referencing what Derek was just saying, you know, I think there's still an issue if you let a sort of a recent sale happen, and the person that has bought the property, you know, has done their due diligence, they've examined the information available, but the information available wasn't sufficiently adequate or clear to make them understand what the constraints were. I think you've set yourself up well behind the 8 ball when it comes to, let's say, a tribunal hearing, because that person is going to get a lot of sympathy because, you know, if your township has sort of left the thing in a state of inadequate information, and it's pretty demonstrable that even with due diligence, somebody might have thought that they could, you know, proceed with reasonable development. You know, I think so. I guess where I'm headed with that is I think it matters. All of these things matter. You know, as Beth said, you know, is there significant development on the property now? So, you know, are you in a situation where you've enjoyed, you know, use of the property? Let's say you've had cottages, you had a cottage on it, etc., and you've maybe had a septic system, and the water level changes. It seems to me that you're going to succeed in arguing for, you know, making some physical changes, dredging, blasting, or whatever to keep using that property. But if that property, on the other hand, with the same zoning over the same time period, was never developed, and you're talking to the original owner, and they come forward and say, well, I'd like to develop now, and you say, well, I'm sorry, we've got more recent information about water level fluctuations, and we have a new set of policies, and you don't seem to meet the criteria for access, etc., then I think you're in a strong position to say no, you know. So I think it does matter. On the other hand, if you just sit there and don't put forward all those rules, that people should look at. And there's a sale that happens, and then that new owner comes forward. I think then you put yourself, back behind the 8 ball again. So I think, I think it's a good idea to have the kind of comprehensive review we're talking about with the U of T students or whatever. But, the longer we sit here with sort of lack of clarity, if you want, as to what's required, you're going to have, you're going to put yourself in the situation that I was referring to, where, somebody's reasonably going to say, oh, well, I did what I thought was reasonable. I checked into things. It had the zoning, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess and to me, this seems like we're going through the cycle again. We did it on undersized islands. We did it with holding zones. This is just another example of, yes, there are constraints out there that should reasonably be applied to say, notwithstanding some zoning, we're moving towards perhaps defining and making it clear that you can't develop there. And, to the point of even when we've got that information in hand, I think there's a duty to change the zoning and say absolutely clearly, based on the information we have, this is not developable. So I guess I'm arguing for, I think, despite all of the uncertainties and, there certainly will be case-by-case reviews, but it's still important to get the information that's necessary to define the things we've been talking about. What's navigable, what's a waterfront lot, and so on, and move forward to put those kind of regulation changes in place. As to an interim control bylaw, I mean, I think we've had the example on 6 Mile Lake where we took that move, but we didn't have a clear mechanism to get on with the studies in the time frame provided. So, the clock ran out. If we were to use that kind of a mechanism, I'd suggest let's do it when we get a clear idea that we've got a mechanism to do the study and that we have a reasonable basis for getting it done in the time frame provided. Otherwise, we're kind of stirring up a hornet's nest. Anyway, just some, planning observations that I think we need to do what we can and do it as soon as we can.
I think sense of urgency is very important. Thank you, Bill. Beth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm wondering whether, sorry, I'll back up. The concept of a waterfront lot has always been in your official plan. The concept of navigability has been there. The weaknesses have been in the definitions, clearly. I'm assuming that you could make a change to a definition or add new definitions to help clarify what's in the zoning bylaw, what's in the official plan. For instance, in the official plan, there's absolutely nothing related to waterfront or navigability or navigable waterway as in the glossary of terms. It's totally silent. And the zoning bylaw does need some augmentation, obviously. And the fluctuation levels in Georgian Bay are not something that are new. We've experienced 6 feet plus, and it is actually going to get greater. The predictions are our highs are going to be higher, and our lows are going to be lower. We're experiencing more tremendous storm surges with climate change. I tried to convey at the last meeting that, in a storm surge, the water level can go up an additional 2 feet in a matter of a half an hour, depending on wind direction and everything else. So the terms that we're talking about are not new terms. They just need clarification. Why couldn't this be done as a technical amendment to those documents?
Through the chairs, and sorry, I don't think.
Housekeeping amendment, sorry.
Yeah, no, I don't think
Chair.
staff have ever indicated that they can't be done. There may be short-term patches for sure that can be considered, right? So, yeah, by no means. There are broader, sort of more global challenges that are best addressed through comprehensive reviews. But there may be short-term, again, I'll use the term patches to help address current policy or regulatory issues. And I think I dare say that might be a more useful and efficient and effective way of addressing some of the immediate concerns, although I hear they've been going on for decades, but addressing some of those immediate concerns rather than an interim control bylaw, which can have significant process and cost implications for the municipality.
Agreed. And if I could, on the ICB, I look at the ICB as just a different strategy to drive action. So you can drive action just by saying, fine, we will take this and we will embrace it and do something about it, you know, in the next few months. Or we will put an ICB in place that gives us a year or more to figure out how to do it. So buy us some time. It's a time strategy. It's not really a topic for discussion. It's a time strategy. And I'm certainly open from my perspective for both strategies, but wanting you to understand the 10-year window where we've basically accomplished nothing on so many of these issues out in the bay. So coming up with some strategy to drive action is very effective. One of the things that has gone through my mind as we've been sitting here talking about things is an analogy that I would like to offer that I think in my mind drives things home fairly solidly. And that is, Bill was talking about the transition from a previous owner to a new owner and the assumptions and so on. And David talked about, you know, I have inherent, you know, rights because I've been doing this for generations. But let's think about this example where back in the day, I had really environmentally focused people. This is an example, it's a theory, right? Not a real thing. But I had really environmentally focused people who wanted to come up to Georgian Bay and they wanted to really enjoy the environmental, the non-developed part of Georgian Bay. And so they get in their canoe and they paddle up to a property and they start enjoying it. They camp out there and life is wonderful. And then they realize, well, wait a minute, we have phenomenal winters here. So I'm going to start hauling stuff up in the winter in snowmobiles because I can move a massive amount of material on a snowmobile in the wintertime. In fact, at my property, I want to move all my stuff in the wintertime on a sleigh because I can get it there right to the back door instead of having to go to the marina, the boat. And anyways, so now I have a scenario where a guy wants to be super environmentally focused and he brings material in the wintertime and he builds himself a lovely cabin and he gets there by canoe and life is wonderful. And then he sells it. Now, I can pretty much guarantee you that every new buyer of property on Georgian Bay, when they're dropping $1 million, $2 million to get into the game, they are not going to be canoeing to that property. And so now they have an immediate need to do all kinds of things that we might consider to be obscene from an environmental standpoint to change that developed property into something that they feel is usable for them, as opposed to that previous owner that canoed in and out. So now we have an example, I think a perfect example of, yes, technically it's developed, but the new owner isn't like the old owner, and the new owner is going to want to do all kinds of things. And what inherent rights does he have that supersede the canoer and the winter developer? And anyways, I think hopefully you get the challenge here, because whether it's that extreme an example or whether it's somewhere, you know, on some continuum, that's, I think, part of the problem that we're dealing with. And when you look at the profile of new buyer, and we've talked about, not in this forum, but in other forums, where new buyers of property up here, you either have the legacy family that bought 50 or 100 years ago and they're just hanging on for dear life, hoping that they can keep paying the taxes that are, you know, going up exponentially. And then you have the new deep-pocketed people coming up who don't understand environmental focus and other kinds of characteristics, and they just want to come up and spend money and make it right. And that's the challenge. And we don't have anything crafted in our policies to help the new buyer understand some of the things that other people for generations have thought would be normal, reasonable things. Like, can you get to your property in low water? That's something that we've understood historically. But the new guy, I mean, the number of examples that I could give you where some new guy buys a chunk of land, thinks he's got it as a steal, and then he realizes, oh my God, I bought something that's not really developable. And then he comes to the township and asks for all kinds of forgiveness here and forgiveness there to do things that really should never have been considered. So when you say that there are inherent rights, I wonder how we can craft policies or definitions that allow us to ensure that these new requests are constrained in some way similar to what our setbacks and fish habitat are and our EPS requirements are. I mean, there's lots of other characteristics. And as I've said earlier, you know, this island issue has been something that has been going on forever. So how do we quickly bundle around those things so that we don't find ourselves 2 years from today having the same discussion? That's not totally rhetorical.
Thank you, because I was wondering if it was rhetorical. I really don't think I'm going to comment. You're treading into territory that really is not within the scope of the Planning Act, and from planning staff's perspective, really should not be considered.
How so?
We can't zone for people and the kind of people and the mindset and the values that those people hold. That'd be my comment.
So I'm not suggesting that for a second. All I'm suggesting is that we'll call it common sense. Okay. Common sense about developing properties and environmental impacts and environmental sensitivity. You can't really write a policy that covers everything. So you do your best and you craft language that covers things as best you can. And when new ideas come along, and I think we've got on our agenda here these two topics that, as Beth has pointed out, they probably need and maybe even an expeditious adjustment to the definitions in the OP and zoning bylaw would be a quick fix to those things. But the point that I'm trying to get to here is that I think I'm trying to project that I think you get it now and you understand things differently than you might have, 6 months ago. So that's a good thing, and we'll call it new common sense. But if you bring somebody new in here tomorrow, whether it's in the planning department or a new buyer, they're not going to have that, what we think is common sense. So how do we craft policies and definitions faster so that we can continue to embed this common sense in our policies, our plans, our zoning bylaws, so that when the new guy comes in, it's clearer for them, so that they don't start thinking about, well, I want to do this, but I didn't know that. And as Bill pointed out, there are a lot of, I didn't know that. I mean, if we as a township could require the real estate agent to come to the township and get a full listing of what you can and can't do based on the zoning criteria on a property and forcibly put that into the real estate listing, that would be marvelous. I don't think we can do that, but I think you get where I'm going. And I think that's where Bill was going as well, which is we collectively, you, the building department and others, know what constraints are and cautions are on these properties. But we know also that the real estate agents are out there advertising Nirvana when it doesn't exist, because they want to make the sale. And not everybody, of course, but that's a common challenge. And so then we end up with a new buyer, as Bill pointed out, with very different sets of expectations and beliefs than what was there before. How do you have any ideas on how we can close that gap? Because that's a common gap we have in our township.
So through the chair, I think we're all in agreement that better regulation, clearer regulation, based on better information and having that information available is important. It's going to help people make informed decisions, appropriately informed decisions. But we can't make them do that due diligence, nor no more than anyone could make someone get a mechanic check out a used car before they buy it. Good idea. And hopefully that mechanic has the right and the best diagnostic equipment and information and all the technical service bulletins on that model and that sort of thing. And that's the part where we can help out. So
in the absence of forcing that kind of structure, then back to Beth's point, I think we need to find a way to aggressively and quickly get to the embedding in our OP and zoning bylaws, things like definitions and other criteria that take the unknown out of the picture and put the known into the picture so that anybody can read it. So that when they come to the township and they say, planning department, we'd like to do this. And you can go, hey, did you read the constraints and the definitions? I mean, that's really where we're trying to go, I think, with the thrust of certainly these two topics and some of the other things we've talked about. But I don't want to belabor the issue. I think we've beaten these two topics up probably enough. Beth, did you want to add in something?
Yeah, I just wanted to read, and it's not perfect either. Everybody knew that the official plan wasn't going to be perfect. But the Cognizine definition, and this was what Member Davis referred to earlier, but it pertains to lot creation. But I think that obviously perhaps needs to be expanded to other situations. But the wording was navigability, or you could say navigable waterway. In this context refers to one's ability to gain convenient access to and from a proposed lot with an appropriate sized recreational watercraft and construction watercraft during both high and low water level conditions without blasting, dredging, or significant shoreline alteration. And I would even go so far a little bit further and talk about the depth of water in low water, because based on the photos we had shown before, the largest barge draws 4 feet, so therefore it would need 5 feet, maybe skimming the bottom.
6.
6, I think you had some
White said they
direction
wouldn't
from a
come in with anything
contractor
less than
about needing
6.
minimum clearance.
Yep.
Maybe 6 feet. So there's a start. And, waterfront lot will be sort of defined somewhere around what it means to have navigability. Because you can't, and I said it before and it's come out before, is you can't create a new lot unless it has access or public access adjacency to a public right-of-way. The waterway is our public right-of-way. Without that, you can't get access. So it is extremely important. It's always been understood. As I say, the circumstances haven't changed. It just unfortunately was very weak in our current documents and needs to be strengthened.
Bill, were you looking to add a comment in?
Well, yeah, I thoroughly agree with that. I think, and based on the conversation we're talking about, that kind of rule and that kind of a definition shouldn't be just about new lots, but obviously about these lots of record that have been sitting there that, have inadequate accessibility circumstances. They should also, clearly what we're talking about is they're subject to this rule as well. And, that's where we come into, where they completely where they completely undeveloped, where there's some established development that, needs to be grandfathered in, and, maybe they get to do something more extreme to maintain accessibility rather than the person who never developed it. So, you need a definition but you need to apply it to those, those different situations we're concerned about.
Yes,
Can I
Beth?
just make one other comment? As we were talking about interim control and just so it's not understood and where I said I supported the concept. I think we were talking about the lots that Bill is referring to here, the undersized lots of record, the undersized that were created before the township bylaws were in existence. So if it's not an interim control bylaw, at least something that defines how you get access to those. Also, there are some provisions in here that talk about if there is fish habitat or it's sensitive shoreline, do you need a site evaluation report, for instance, before you just say, go ahead and build and here's your permit. Those things are in there. They're often not implemented, but maybe some wording around that strengthens too. If it's a waterfront lot, but if it has those sensitive zoning, whether it's EP or type 1 fish habitat, that it requires more than just the depth of water, perhaps.
So Derek, if I could put you and Deb on the spot again. My understanding from previous chats with you is you welcome the opportunity to hear the discussion as it helps you formulate your strategies and going forward. What actions or resolutions do you think would be useful, if any, from today's session?
In terms of, sorry, your resolution from this committee?
Yeah.
I mean, what staff were seeking, we very much got out of it was the background to these two issues on the agenda to understand the details and the drivers behind them. And what I'm very happy is it's very much in line with the problem question that staff arrived at. We gave it different labels. We didn't call it waterfront lots and navigable waterways, but it's the same issue that we're looking at through Professor Hay and his team. So I think we're all going in the same direction here. So I don't know that I need a specific direction other than that the information be received. And from staff's perspective, I think it's very well received. It's very validating for us because these are the things that we're already looking at and talking about. Now I understand what certainly the advisory committee and council themselves are referring to when they speak of the issue of defining a waterfront lot and defining navigable waterways. And there's a lot of interrelated pieces here, obviously, that we're straight into. They're related. I mean, we got off topic, but I see why we did. So I appreciate that. So I don't know that I need specific direction, but I've got the information that I need. And it validates that we're on the right track in terms of the research we're doing. And really the question for me at this point, and I'm not looking for direction from the committee, but one of the asks I'm hearing here is, whether there's short-term measures. I use the term patches, maybe there's a better term for it, but short-term amendments that can be done while we await that longer process, which is going to be the OP and zoning bylaw review, which even once it's commenced, these are long processes. They're subject to their own, there are other agencies involved. These are measured in years. So what can we do in the short-term horizon that plugs some of the holes in the dike? So that's something that I'm getting from this meeting, that staff can look into and report back to this committee on, in terms of whether there are some sort of short-term amendments, the official plan or zoning bylaw to address some of the concerns or the substantive ones.
I'm speaking for most of or maybe hopefully all of the committee. We would thoroughly appreciate that kind of a strategy of having the planning department come up with recommendations and how to clarify some of these definitions or put a couple other criteria in there to reflect the nature of the conversation and the sense of urgency of the conversation. Beth.
Microphone, please.
I'm sorry. I'm going to suggest that we actually perhaps would benefit from having a resolution adopted by this committee because it is more than just navigable waterway and waterfront lot. There are a number of other definitions in the zoning bylaw. For instance, marine vessel right now means a craft designed to float on the water, including a boat, barge, or ship. So that clearly needs to be, I think, clarified. A vessel is not a canoe in a waterfront lot situation. Something that floats on the water totally should not be in that category. Navigable waterway we've talked about, that is a definition in the zoning bylaw. Water access lot means a lot that has frontage on a water body is not capable of obtaining access from a provincial road or private road. I think that needs to be elaborated upon. The definition of water body itself. And those are just a few, and that's just in the bylaw today. As I said, the OP is totally silent on any of these terms whatsoever in the glossary of terms. So I'd like to propose a resolution that we request housekeeping amendments to address these terms that I've just reviewed.
Okay. Sydney, would you like to draft on the fly, or perhaps Beth would
Well, the terms would be marine vessel, navigable waterway, water access lot.
Okay, sorry, navigable, I'm just opening up. Navigable waterway, vessel,
Water access lot
water,
and water body, and what the actual term waterfront lot should be potentially refined. I don't have that one here. I don't know what it says.
So if I could, I think what you're saying is that we would have a resolution that recommends to council that council ask the planning department to consider updating the definitions of these items. And that would just kind of package
Through
up
a housekeeping
through a
amendment.
housekeeping bylaw. Does that make sense?
It does. I think the particulars of what that looks like, what definitions to amend or what policies to address. It may not be necessary to include that in the resolution. I think just. the-
Right. So
the
I
direction,
think,
yeah.
I think the resolution would say we would ask council to ask planning to review and propose updates to these items. And we aren't, I don't think we're looking today to put in that resolution, the definitions
No.
that should be in there. But we would welcome your dialogue with us as a group or individual members to assist in that.
Yeah, I think bringing it back to the agenda items to, to look at the items that address the issues of waterfront lots and navigable waterways. And there's, as we heard, there's a whole bunch of interrelated definitions and that sort of thing. And I don't want to start, I don't suggest you put those into the motion, but I'm in your hands.
Okay.
If I could, I think vessel is certainly something that you need to look at because it is referred to in the navigable waterway definition. So if you don't look at vessel, then your navigable waterway definition isn't complete.
And through the chair, sorry, I'm by no means saying we don't look at that. I just don't think it's necessary to put that level of detail in terms of what specific definitions to look at or not look at in the motion. That's all.
So given that technically I'm going to get in trouble here if I go too far. Technically, we're supposed to stay with the agenda items. And so the resolution would most likely read something to the effect of that we would ask council to ask planning to update the definitions of waterfront lots and navigable waterways and related definitions that impact those terms. And that way we're staying within the.
I don't, sorry, through the chair.
Yes.
I don't see an issue talking about vessel. I think those are all kind of related within that topic, so I don't
Yep.
think that's skewing too far
Okay.
from the agenda topic. I have some wording here. I just want to get some direction from planning and also members, just to make sure that I'm on the right track here. So be it resolved that the Planning Advisory Committee recommends to council to direct staff to update the following definitions through a housekeeping amendment: navigable waterway, vessel, water access lot, waterfront lot, and water body. Did I miss something there or cover?
Such as in there, so that we're not seen to be limiting it to just those.
Yeah.
No.
Derek.
So the only comment I just to add context to it is these are already work plan items that have been identified. There's previous resolutions from council on this matter. So it comes back to this prioritization. So if this is the new priority, and that's the direction that may come from council, coming from a motion that this committee adopts, then other things will go down on the priority list. And we're coming back to that discussion at this point. So
Got it.
what are the priorities for the township in terms of the planning issues? And yeah.
So I hear you. I don't disagree with you that there are priority issues to consider. What I think I'm hearing from Beth is that having it documented kind of raises the visibility, and passing it on to council is a useful step of visibility on this matter. And I think the other councillors will benefit from understanding the concern and the visibility. So I'm comfortable with what Sydney read out.
Do we want to add a line that says and report back to the committee with the proposed definitions or something along the lines? Okay.
No. And rather than say report, perhaps we could say share suggested wording with the committee members. I think that would be less effort than a report. Does that sound reasonable, Derek?
Sorry.
I'm just
Can you
saying,
repeat that?
rather than asking you to report back to the committee, just to share suggested changes to the definitions with the committee. So the word sharing as opposed to a report hopefully is less formal and less effort.
Certainly, and again, I just want to caution, the scope of the work may not just be the changing of definitions, right? That's certainly part of it, right? But that's why, that was my only concern with getting too specific in the motion.
Okay. Yes.
Through the chair, I don't love the term share, just because I do think it should be a little bit more formal, just in the essence of transparency. So not saying there needs to be a full report associated with it, but maybe just like a memo that's attached to agenda item, just so that the public can also see what these proposed, so it's not just through an email to the committee, because then that could lead to some back and forth discussion through email. I just think it should take place during a meeting.
Okay.
So I just prefer report, and then Derek can choose however he wants to do that. If it's maybe a verbal report in a meeting or memo or a report. So that's okay.
I'm okay with that. Any do we need to read it again? Yeah, yes, no, Bill, yes.
To just read through it, then what we have.
Just, be it resolved that the Planning Advisory Committee recommends to council to direct staff to update the following definitions through a housekeeping amendment, such as navigable waterways, vessel, water access lot, waterfront lot, water body, and that staff report back to the committee with the proposed definitions.
Can I have a mover for that? That would be Beth, and a seconder would be Bill. And by show of hands, hold on, we have David. You want to comment on it before we?
No, through you, Mr. Chair, it wasn't, it was in relation to a specific definition So you can go through the motion first and I can ask my question following that.
Okay, so we'll come back to you after that, but all in favor by raising hands. And carried. Thank you. And over to you, David.
Through you, Mr. Chair, just was wondering, the current definition of waterfront lot, is that inclusive at all of the lake bed in front of that lot off the frontage? And the reason I ask is it ties back to Beth's question on definition of vessel. And we know there's other issues in front of council in relation to floating homes, that if that's deemed a property that's not developable, but they've got that lake bed, then is this an opportunity for those floating homes to come in as a workaround? So knowing what is included in waterfront lot and also that definition of vessel would be something I think that would be nice to know. And I'm sorry, I don't know if it includes that or not.
So I'll partially answer it and then we'll ask Derek to maybe add to it. But generally speaking, in our township, we don't own into the water. We own to the high water mark or whatever the shoreline shore road allowance definite wording provides. So there are going to be very, very few properties in the township that have any ownership of the land under the water. Is that answering your question or no?
Yeah, it does. I know one case in particular where there is that, and that somebody had parked something there and had to have it removed. So I was wondering if that applied elsewhere, and I think you've answered the question. Thank you.
Okay, Peter.
Just because we're running out of time, I had one other matter I wanted to raise, and that goes back to the official plan review and zoning bylaw review, and Derek's comments earlier about identifying the scope. And I just wanted to ask the planning department if you have any suggestions in terms of how this committee can help you identify items or scope of review. And I'm thinking, collectively we have many, many years of experience in this township dealing with planning issues. And from that, I think many of us have identified some areas where the official plan and the zoning bylaws could be improved. And I don't need you necessarily to answer it today, but whether we do this through future meetings or through correspondence with committee members, how can we best help the planning department in the process of initiating the official plan review?
Derek, please.
I don't know whether this requires direction from council or not, but I certainly staff fully intend to use this committee as the sounding board, not only for the documents themselves, but for crafting the terms of reference that would, form the RFP. So that from my standpoint, that's a given, and that's the first step in how this committee can assist in that regard.
So just as a general comment, Derek is key in helping craft agenda items. And I'm certain from his comment that where the planning department could benefit from discussions related to the OP and zoning bylaw changes, that you will be trying to add those agenda items to the agenda. Is that fair? Okay. David.
Through you, Mr. Chair, sorry, I didn't lower my hand, so.
Ready. Okay.
We've been talking about navigable waterway. Right, we've been talking about navigable waterway and waterfront lot. And there's probably going to be two definitions for waterfront lot, because you've got a waterfront lot that has road access. But what we've been talking about today is obviously a waterfront lot on a water access only community. So maybe there's two different definitions, perhaps. because you've got to distinguish the two. That's all.
Alrighty, in that case, I will ask for a mover and a seconder for this resolution, which is be it resolved that the Planning Advisory Committee does now adjourn at 11:56 a.m. until July 5th, or the call of the chair. Can I have a mover? Beth, and a seconder, David, and all in favor by show of hands. And motion carried. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.